This is the Sennheiser HD600, and I bought every ear pad that I could for it on the market. I measured every single ear pad that I got, and I'm going to tell you which ones are actually worth getting and which ones aren't. By the way, this also applies to all the other similar Sennheiser models. They're listed on the screen here. Roll my sleeves up for this one. Okay, two things we need to cover first. There will be an LTT Labs article dropping the same time as this video. You can check that out, the link in the video description, where we go over some more of these things in detail. The second thing is that the HD6XO series is usually better with the stock pads. Just how it is. While sometimes you might get a frequency response improvement, usually you sacrifice on a thing called timbre, which is just how natural things sound. But I don't want to waste too much of your time. Let's get into the measurements. I'm going to sort these by brand, starting off with Dekoni. I have all of these Dekoni pads here, but only one of them I recommend. I also have this entire bin, so buckle up. First, let's check out the Dekoni Choice Leather. These do come with foams. They are a solid pad, which honestly is pretty soft and comfy. These sit at about 30 millimeters deep, 42 to 43 millimeters wide, and about 66 millimeters tall. They do come with foams, which is important, but I don't love the way they sound. They are pretty bassy, pretty warm, too much so, I would say, and they have some pretty heavy recesses in the ear gain and the treble. Now, all this is recorded on the Brüel & Kjær 4128C, which is a rig that already kind of overestimates 3 kilohertz a little bit. You can see how this would end up sounding warm and dark and a bit too much of both. Next up is the Dekoni Choice Suede. In terms of dimensions, these are basically the same as the other Dekonis I just showed you. They do also come with foams, and they suffer from the same problem. A bit too much warmth where it kind of bleeds into the mid-range, though not as bad as the previous ones, but the big problem with these is that they are very, very, very relaxed on the treble. They're quite dark. Between that and the increase in the lows, it makes them sound very dark and warm. If you're super treble sensitive, this might be the way to go, but they do start to kind of elevate back up around 13 kilohertz, so that might not be to your taste. Again, there's one of these that I do recommend, but we're not there yet. Next up is the Dekoni Elite Hybrid. Similar dimensions to the previous, they do come with foams, and similar story in the bass, only way too much bass happening, way too much in the low mid-range. If this was strictly a sub-bass increase, it would be awesome, but these are far too warm. Most of the treble, part of the mid-range, pretty similar to stock with a little bit more of a recess around 1.8 kilohertz, and then a bit of extra energy in the treble above 10 kilohertz. These are going to sound super warm with a slight V shape in the upper treble. Again, not to my taste. Dekoni Elite Sheepskin is next. Again, same on dimensions. They do come with foams and similar problems. Too warm in the low frequencies, bleeding into the mid-range, and recesses in the ear gain and treble. We're getting down to the last two Dekonis here. Which one is the one that you think I recommend? Here's the Dekoni Elite Velour, and it's not the one of the two that I recommend. It does come with foams also, similar dimensions, and, what do you know, recesses in the ear gain and a bit too much warmth in the low frequencies. This one is a bit less of an offender than some of the previous ones, so you might actually end up liking it. Personally, I find this to be too recessed between 2 kilohertz and maybe 3.5 kilohertz, with a little bit too much warmth added as well. And that leaves the Dekoni pad I do recommend for the HD600. This is the Dekoni Fenestrated Sheepskin. Bet you didn't expect it was this one, huh? Comes with foams, similar dimensions. This is warmer than the stock pads, I would say by a notable amount, but it's not super boomy. It is balanced out by the treble being mostly similar to stock. There is a little bit less, around 2 kilohertz. That starts to get to be a bit much for me, but it's not crazy. Around 3 kilohertz and up is pretty similar, slightly more energy above 10 kilohertz. This one overall does get my seal of approval. I would say that the timbre is not quite as good as stock, but it does have better bass than stock in a way that isn't crazy out of balance with the mids and trebles. So if you wanted slightly better bass and are willing to sacrifice a little bit of timbre and you need bigger ear space, these make sense. That is our first thumbs up of the video. Next is the ZMF pads. I have talked about these before years ago, and actually, these have held up really well. This is the same pair of ZMF perforated suede HD600 pads that I've had for years, and they still measure very similar to how they did back then. These are about 45-ish millimeters wide, about 69 millimeters tall. Nice. At their deepest point, they're about 29 to 30 millimeters deep, and on the more shallow end, they are about 22 millimeters deep. Here's the perforated suede ones. These are the ones I recommend out of the ZMF lineup. They are damn near stock. Very slight differences in the treble, a little bit less at 2 kilohertz and then a little bit less around, I think, like 6 to 8 kilohertz. Other than that, these are basically dead on and seem to be a more durable replacement for the stock pads if you want one that you don't have to replace basically every 1.5 to 2 years. Thumbs up. These two, not so much. The ZMF solid lambskin pad, as you can see here, pretty decent lift in the bass, but a bit too much warmth in the low mid-range. We have a weird recess happening in the treble, and it's just a bit too much for me personally. These are a no-go for me. The perforated lambskin, very, very good up until the treble where we get a bit of a weird dip. If you find that part of the treble to be kind of harsh in that like 6-ish to 8-ish kilohertz range, you might like these because it's basically the same as stock outside of that range. But because of that dip, I'm not personally a fan of it. I would say just go with the suede version. These ones are not for me. Next, we have these pads by AHG. They are perforated lambskin and they do come with foams. They also come with more treble. This is one of the only headphones I tested that had less bass and more treble than stock. If you find the stock HD600 to sound kind of dark, you might like these, but it's a pretty substantial increase from like 2 kilohertz and up. I don't like these pads. Just gonna leave it at that. I don't think they sound good. But if you really, really want more treble across the board than an HD600, 650, so on, you could use these. By the way, the best pad out of this entire video I'm saving for a little bit later. These are the WC Freeze pads from Wicked Cushions. They do come with foams built into the pad, so it's not removable. And this is a cooling gel pad. The cooling gel feels kind of nice, though it's worth noting they do trap in some heat after a while. These are a little bit bigger feeling than the stock pads at around 69 tall, nice, 49 wide, and 25 deep. The problem is these don't sound quite as good. They do have a nice increase in bass, but it's a bit too much in the low mid-range. They start to get a little bit boomy. This wouldn't be too much of a problem if the treble kept up, but we have a weird recess in the ear gain that kind of does some wonky things. If it was an even recess in the ear gain, it might not be so bad, but this does do some weird up and down, kind of a roller coaster throughout the treble right there. Around 1.8 kilohertz, we dip a few decibels below the bounds, and the same is true around 5 kilohertz. Other than that, they lined up pretty closely, but the dips in that region just make it sound odd. And keep in mind, again, this is a measurement rig that we know already overestimates the 3 kilohertz region by a bit. So realistically, these are kind of scooped in the ear gain region, and I just don't see that as very competitive. They are comfy though. Next up, we have GVO ears. These are simply listed online as GVO ears black. They do come with foams and they're pretty plush and puffy. These are 38 millimeters wide, 64 millimeters tall, and a plump 31 millimeters deep. They are pretty comfy. Compared to stock, I find them to sit just a little bit farther off the ear. And these are not bad. They do have an increase in bass, an increase in the low mid-range, also making them sound warm, but most of the treble is in line with stock. There is a bit more treble emphasis above 10 kilohertz, around 14K, so you'll probably notice these are more airy sounding and more warm sounding than the stock pads. I could do with a little bit less warmth than these, but honestly, these aren't bad, and I don't feel bad giving these the thumbs up if you want something that is a bit more air and a little bit more warmth than the stock sound. These are the GVO ears gray velour, or on the back of their packaging, they call them Starry Sky. These do come with foams, as you can see, and look at that, a gray velour pad. They're about 65 millimeters tall, 42 millimeters wide, and about 31 millimeters deep. They add impressively more bass without adding too much more low mid-range, which is really nice. The downside is they totally lose it in the treble. The ear gain and the treble are recessed just too much for it to make sense, and they don't sound very good. If they could have maintained that better bass without ruining the treble, these would have been winners, but they are not. These do not get my recommendation. And our third set of GVO ears, these are called the Black Velvet pads. They do come with foams, and you'll notice immediately they're a bit wider around than the stock pads are. So they're about 43 millimeters wide, 73 to 74 millimeters tall, and about 28 millimeters deep. These are pretty comfortable. If you find the stock pads to just be too small vertically or horizontally for your ears, this does solve that problem. They're very spacious, though not as deep as some of the other pads we've tested. The problem is they do some weird things in the treble. They do add more bass, very tastefully so, and this is a good amount of bass add and a good amount of low mid-range add without them sounding like crazy warm or bloated. But they have this weird sort of dip going on around like 5 kilohertz that I'm just not a fan of. It's not the worst, and this is better than a lot of the pads we've already seen so far, but it's not quite enough to get my recommendation, especially knowing with what's coming down the road. But if you wanted something that is relatively similar to stock and you don't mind this dip, it's something that's maybe just a little bit more airy too, these are actually decent for that. Next, we have this Yaxi pad, another one that is notably larger than stock. They are 48 millimeters wide, 77 millimeters tall, holy guacamole, and around 31 to 32 millimeters deep. These sound like crap. Super elevated low mids, just to the point where it's a bloated, boomy, muddy mess. The mid-range and treble, really solid, but just way too much happening in the low mids. These do not get my recommendation. These are the Krone pads, and they do come with foams. They are around 39 millimeters wide, 65 to 66 millimeters tall, and around 29 millimeters deep. These are basically the same thing as stock pads, but with a little bit more bass and a fair bit more upper treble above 10 kilohertz. If you want your HD600s to be very similar to stock, but be quite airy, but basically the same everywhere else, that's what these do. That's pretty much it. So like some others, if you wanted something that makes them more airy but doesn't change much else, the Krones are a decent option for that, but they are not my favorite one on this list. They get a mild thumbs up. These are the Jwag pads. You need that. And you want to know why? Because these are impossible to get on the headphone and near impossible to take off. They have this extra bit of foam right here that presses against the headphone while you're trying to clip them in. And you have to apply so much force to get these to clip onto your HD600. Once you finally do get them on, I find this material to be a bit too abrasive for my face. It's just kind of rough. I feel like it makes me very sweaty and agitated. I imagine this is what it'd be like if you rubbed a shoe up against your face. They have some bass elevation. It does bleed into the low mid-range. It's not crazy, but it's not the worst we've seen either. Most of the rest of the treble is fine. I just find these uncomfortable and hard to put on, so what's the point? Now, these are the two best pads that I have tested besides stock. These come with foams. These are the Solwit lambskin pads. They are 40 millimeters wide, 67 millimeters tall, and about 26 millimeters deep, at least this pair is, the lambskins. They're very similar to stock. They have more sub bass, which is nice, a tiny bit more warmth in the low mid-range, and other than that, they are almost dead on with the stock tuning, about a decibel less in most of the treble until you get to around 13-14 kilohertz, and then they start to just stay level instead of recessing in. These sound great. They are a lot like the stock pads, but with barely more punch and barely more upper treble. It makes them sound a bit more articulated. Though the downside is I do find them to get a little bit warm on my head after a while. Not too much, they're still breathable, but it is a little bit more temperature-wise warm on my head than the stock pads. These get a strong thumbs up. And then there's these, which is, funny enough, a cooling gel pad that gets a pretty strong recommendation. These are the Solwit cooling gel pads that come with foams. They're a little bit different in dimension from the other ones, at around 40 millimeters wide, around 68 millimeters tall, and then about 29 millimeters deep. The cooling gel in these is very effective. It's already cool on my face, look at that. And they are just about dead on with stock, but they kind of take away what people refer to as the Sennheiser veil. They have slightly like a decibel better sub bass without adding anything at all to the low mid range. So it's slightly more sub bass, but not any warmer at all than stock. And then basically everything from 2 kilohertz up is increased by about a decibel until you get to 13, 14 kilohertz, and then we have more air over that. These are great. Now, I will say, I think that the timbre with vocals specifically on these stock Sennheiser pads from Sennheiser is a little bit better. But things like electronics or anything that is very fast and articulated or clicky or has fine details just sounds better on these Solwit cooling gel pads. I was very impressed with these and actually really surprised. I thought, oh, a cooling gel pad's probably going to measure and sound like crap. But these ended up being one of the best ones out of the whole roundup. And there you have it, a handful of things that I recommend. It basically is going to boil down to these 4 above the rest, the 2 Solwit pads, the Dekoni fenestrated sheepskin, and the ZMF suede perforated pad for the HD600 series. Again, at the time of publishing this video, there will be an article up on the lab's website. You should check that out. It'll be at the link in the video description. And stick around because I am making a review of the Head D1. I know that one's a little bit late coming to the party, but I really wanted to take my time with it. If you want early access to videos, you can check out the Patreon and the float plane, both at the link in the video description. And as always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Until next one, guys. Peace.